What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue and I hope you're all doing well today. For our final patch 905 guidelines update, we have Subtlety Rogue. This video will cover a lot of things, mainly from a PvE perspective, and it will include things like Conduits, Soulbind choices, Covenant choices, Legendaries, talents, and more. So thank you so much for joining me today. Now let's talk Subtlety Rogue. As always, this video will be time-stamped and segmented out so you can skim through the information at your leisure. If you have any questions, then feel free to leave a comment, or you can swing by my community Discord to ask. The link for that will be in the description of this video. And also a quick thank you and shout out to the folks over on the Ravenholt Discord, especially all the theory crafters and community figures for all the information they put out there for the community to use. If you haven't stopped by there before, I highly recommend it, as there is a wealth of information. And as a quick disclaimer that I often try to mention in these guideline and recommendation videos, there is only a few % of overall damage difference in most realistic situations for things like your Covenant choice, meaning just because you aren't playing that specific quote-unquote best option, doesn't mean you can't perform very well if that's what you want to do. While min-maxing is a bit of a slippery slope, it is a desire for some folks, and only you can decide why you want to pick each Covenant and the reasons behind it. Heck, for all I know, you just want to pick one because of the Covenant Sanctum or the Transmog, and there isn't anything wrong with that, so I'll try to go over each Covenant and the information about them as best as I can. For spec-specific changes for Subtlety Rogue, patch 905 was a pretty uneventful update. While numerous of the Subtlety-specific legendaries were buffed and some generic choices for Rogue were as well, none of these will have a noticeable impact on your legendary choices enough to shake up your ideal options. One really big thing you need to know though is if you're running the Mark of the Master Assassin legendary, this legendary will now only affect your auto attacks and your rogue damaging abilities, so basically it doesn't work with your trinkets and it won't work on the weapons and necrotic wake. Probably the most noteworthy thing you'll see as far as changes for patch 905 as Subtlety is that both the Venthyr and Necrolords were buffed a bit. Realistically though, in most situations, the total difference from the best to worst choice is only a couple % overall, but they were changed enough to make things a little different. For the Venthyr, the recent buffs to the Flagellation ability and the Lashing Scars Flagellation-specific Conduit have brought the Venthyr up to edge out the other Covenants as the strongest in pure single target damage, though by a very small margin. The strength of the new Flagellation, combined with the potent Lashing Scars Potency Conduit, allows for Subtlety to have even better burst damage, though at the cost of being slightly less potent in multi-target or AoE situations. And while I'm not much of a PvPer, this newly found burst with Flagellation has become an exceptional choice for arenas from what I've seen of it so far. Nagia the Mistblade is the strongest single-target Soulbind choice with the Thrillseeker haste buff, as well as the 3% damage debuff applied via the Dauntless Duelist passive. This can only affect one target at a time though, and it will need to die for a new target to be able to receive the debuff. Theotar is a slightly stronger choice for AoE situations, with Soothing Shade giving a sizable mastery buff, though it requires being able to stand within a specific area to benefit from it, which can be difficult in some situations. If you are using Theotar, you'll want to make sure you take both Potency Conduit slots, and ideally Lashing Scars and Planned Execution will be your two choices. This can of course change based on your Conduit level, so it's always best to sim your options. For encounters with multiple targets, the Necrolords have become quite a strong choice with the buffed and slightly redesigned Serrated Bone Spike. This move is a cheap combo point generator that also applies a permanent bleed to your target, with the added perk of generating extra combo points based on how many Bone Spike bleeds you have active. While the bleed doesn't sound that impressive at first, over long duration multi-target fights it becomes a solid source of overall damage. For a Soulbind, Bonesmith Earmere is the most well-rounded and generally strongest choice available. The passive agility buff from Forgeborn Reveries is a nice passive gain just for having your gear enchants on, which you of course should and aren't a baddie and haven't forgotten to enchant your ring for like 2 weeks. The Marrow Gemstone passive is also a strong source of critical strike chance, making it the ideal choice for the final choice in Earmere's Soulbind tree. Emony does seem to be like a somewhat more common than expected choice though, and I find it's most likely for the group-wide benefit that Lead by Example can offer. This not only gives the rogue a 5% agility buff every time you cast Serrated Bone Spike, but you'll benefit up to 4 nearby allies with a 2% primary stat buff for 5 seconds, and for each ally you benefit, you will receive another 2% agility. On paper, this doesn't sim as the strongest Soulbind choice because it doesn't factor in the benefit that your allies are receiving too, just the buff that you're receiving. So it does offer some group-wide buffs, and in situations where you can get extra charges of bone spike from things dying, this can be beneficial to your group. However, it's kinda weird in Mythic Plus, which is where you would think this would be a very strong choice, because Subtlety has by far the most efficient way to generate combo points in AoE situations, since Shuriken Storm will give you a combo point for every enemy it hits. On top of that, it can also apply a shortened version of Find Weakness if it critically hits, whereas Serrated Bone Spike does not, and requires multiple Bone Spikes to be active to keep up with the intense combo point generation of Shuriken Storm. If you're currently a Night Fae, you are still in a pretty good place in both single target and dungeon-oriented situations overall, as both Naya and Kyrian are excellent in each of these forms of content. Naya's Burst trait is a very strong source of single target damage procs, whereas Kyrian has both the First Strike crit chance bonus and Wild Hunt tactics, which offers a damage boost to any enemies above 75% health. And while rogues are a pretty mobile class, the added blink and movement of Soul Shape is definitely a plus. Lastly, we have the Kyrian. The Kyrian have access to a very strong defensive item, the Phial of Serenity. Not only does this work as an extra heal, but it can also remove practically anything that Cloak of Shadows can't for debuffs, which can be really handy in certain raid and boss encounters, though they did kinda nerf this a little while ago for some of the Castle Nathria specific debuffs. Both Pelagos and Clea can sim very close together in performance for both single target and dungeon situations, though both have a bit of positioning requirements. With Pelagos, combat meditation requires a bit of movement to collect the orbs to extend your mastery buff, whereas the crit bonus from Clea's Pointed Courage requires allies to be within like 8 yards or so for them to count towards your crit buff. Kyrian is the lowest performing of the 4 Covenants in terms of raw damage output, but it has a variety of defensive and group-wide buffs to consider, and as I've mentioned a couple times, the damage difference isn't some insane amount, but it is notably that they are the lowest in single target, multi-target, and Mythic Plus. Next, let's go over our potency conduit choices. Overall, Subtlety's spec-specific planned execution is the best overall choice, since it merely buffs your crit chance during Symbols of Death windows. This is always lined up with the Shadow Dance and is your big burst window, so this improves that burst even further. Deeper daggers can be a pretty viable option in AoE situations when you start using the Black Powder ability as your main combo point finisher, which is really when you're around 3 targets or more. If you're a Venthyr though, Lashing Scars adds quite a bit of burst damage to Flagellation and is ideally your top choice over anything else instead. This can vary a bit based on your level of your conduits of course, but this should hold true for most folks out there. For Legendaries, Subtlety has received a bit of tuning in patch 905, but as I mentioned earlier, neither the Rotten nor Deathly Shadows are more impressive than the main contenders of Legendary power choices. For your best all-arounder, Finality is a great choice as Subtlety. This will benefit you well in pure single target by buffing your Eviscerates and Ruptures, as well as in AoE with improved Black Powder damage. Technically speaking, Akari's Soul Fragment is a little bit better in pure single target than Finality, but outside of literally one target, Finality is just better in all other aspects. Mark of the Master Assassin is also a very strong choice for Subtlety in Mythic Plus, but does require your re-stealths as often as possible to get as many guaranteed crit windows. Next, let's go over our stat itemization. This is always kind of a hot topic because people want exact numbers or percent values for everything, but it isn't really that simple due to the dynamic nature of stat values and all the outside influences that are put on them, like your gear and your talents and your covenant choice and your legendary choice and all that. Due to this, I always recommend using top gear simulations on raid bots to find out exactly what your best combination of gear is, and don't quite stress over hitting like exactly 31% crit or 19.573% haste or anything like that. Anyways, agility is still by far your strongest damage increasing stat, so you'll often find item level upgrades to offer some DPS gain, but for secondary stats, versatility and crit are very good to get as a Subtlety rogue. Whereas both haste and mastery kinda swap places a bit depending on the type of PvE content you're focusing on. For example, haste is a stronger stat for single target, whereas mastery gains value in AoE due to the larger amount of finishing moves you'll be using due to greater combo point generation. Mastery is of course a very strong stat in PvP as well, however that is a bit outside the scope of this guide since I try to focus mainly on the PvE side of things for now. And I reiterate, always make sure to sim gear, because even if something doesn't have like your best stats on it or whatever, the agility alone might make up for using it still. I alluded to this just a little bit ago, so next we'll talk about talents. Your talent choices in Subtlety have a couple variations based on single target or AoE, though some choices can seem pretty comparable if you have a preference. For pure single target encounters, you'll find that Weapon Master, Shadow Focus, Deeper Stratagem, Enveloping Shadows, and Master of Shadows will give you the strongest combination of talent choices. For a more dungeon-oriented build, you'll want to swap Weapon Master for Premeditation and Master of Shadows for Secret Technique. There is a bit of a quirkiness to Premeditation though, as sometimes it just decides it doesn't want to give you the extra combo points even after it was supposedly fixed in patch 905. So while this talent is supposed to be better for dungeons, you might not want to gamble with it, deciding that it just might not want to work correctly every now and then. These choices also depend on if you want to prioritize single target over AoE and can change based on your group's needs, but these two talent loadouts should give you a good idea of what to expect from Subtlety. And as a quick mention for a passive specific to Subtlety that people should be really aware of. While you technically are able to wear a slow weapon in your offhand as Subtlety, which some PvPers do for stat itemization, in PvE you want to make sure both your weapons are daggers. This is due to the Shadow Technique's passive, which causes your successful auto attacks to have a chance to give you 1 combo point and 8 energy. This is basically a hidden little internal counter on your auto attacks, and it works like this. Your first 3 successful auto attacks, meaning ones that aren't dodged or parried, cannot proc Shadow Techniques. However, your 4th successful one will have a 50% chance, and your 5th one will be a guaranteed proc. This means you want the fastest weapons that you can equip in both your main hand and offhand, so be sure to wear daggers. The only time this might not be true for you is if your offhand is like way higher item level than the next dagger that you have, like if you have a sword that's 30, 40 item levels higher, then you might need to sim and just test for yourself. It usually has to be a pretty huge difference in item level for that to happen though, but try your best to get 2 decent daggers so that won't be an issue for you. While there wasn't a ton of huge changes to Subtlety in patch 905, I wanted to make sure that all of the most relevant information was put together into one specific video for this patch, so I hope this information proves useful to you. If so, then maybe consider leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. It's all tremendously appreciated and helps a lot with the channel's growth. And as always, my gratitude to you, my viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.